Now that's significant. The Market Research Podcast.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining us on this latest episode of Now That's Significant, a market research podcast. This is your host, Michael Howard, the Head of Marketing at InfoTools. Today, we're joined by Dr Parves Khan. Parves has been working in the field of data analytics for almost 3 decades, leading the global insight functions across private and public sector companies, including FTSE 100 businesses. As a board member of London Women in Tech, a group of over 5,000 members dedicated to normalising gender balance and equality in the UK's tech industries, and of the G100 movement, a global movement of women leaders committed to bringing about gender parity in the workplace and beyond. Parves is passionate about diversity, equity and inclusion. She has published several articles on women in leadership and has a book on leadership coming out next year, published by Pearson Business Books, and that's called The Power of Women: Stop Blocking and Start Empowering Women at Work. You can pre-order this now on Amazon. In May 2021, Dr. Khan was awarded the accolade of being one of the UK's 20 top most inspirational women in data and technology by Women in Data, which is a movement and a force for change in the realm of data science and analytics. Parves is currently CEO of ESOMAR, a global industry and professional association driving excellence in research, insight, and data. Thanks for joining us on the show today, Parves.
Thank you for having me, Michael.
You're quite all right. So what's the most significant thing you're going to tell us today, Parves?
Well, from that introduction, you might have guessed I care a lot about diversity and inclusion, particularly at that leadership level. So it kind of follows that I thought I'd share some statistics on the proportion of women in senior and executive management in the market research industry globally. Now, the significant thing is I quickly realized how challenging that was going to be, because there is a serious dearth of research mapping the state of diversity in our own industry. And that's not helped by the fact that market research at a national level isn't recognized as a standard industry classification in its own right, but is often lumped together with, for example, professional services and other national services in those national statistics. So we can't even gross up from that national level to establish a global picture. And I'm hoping that at ESOMAR, as part of the new council, that we be really looking into plugging some of those data gaps, perhaps with a new committee specifically looking at diversity and inclusion. So what figures do we have? Well, we've got a few studies that were commissioned by Women in Research, more colloquially known as WIRE. WIRE is a network which I'm sure your audience will be very familiar with. Now, WIRE commissioned a piece of research back in 2019 of the top 150 market research companies. And what it found is that about 13% of those companies had a CEO who is a woman. Now, those companies were skewed towards the US and the UK, given those, the UK and the US are the largest markets, of course. Now, 13% doesn't feel particularly high, but it's certainly better when it's benchmarked with other industries. For example, a survey carried out by Credit Suisse, also in 2019, of 3,000 companies, and this was across 56 countries, found that women only account for 3% of CEOs in the information technology sector, only 4% in financial services, and only 5% in real estate. And in fact, when they looked at all industries, only 8% or fewer had women CEOs. So 13% amongst our top companies doesn't actually feel like it's too bad. But of course, the proportion of women CEOs in market research also needs to be assessed against the overall proportion of women working in our industry, Michael. And there is a perception, isn't there, that market research is a very female-dominated industry. And whilst there isn't a lot of hard data, there was some analysis done by a job site very recently by Zippia. It's a job site only looking at the US market, admittedly, but given the lack of data, let's take the US as a proxy for now. And according to that study, it found that over half, 55% of market researchers in the US are women. Now, given over half are women, then only just over 1 in 10, 13% of those CEOs being women, actually in that context does feel like a big disparity.
And does indeed. There's a long way to go for us. So before we go on looking into what companies can do to try and bridge this gap and help women rise into leadership, can we perhaps reflect a little on your own journey and how potentially being a woman has impacted your leadership journey as well?
Right, well, I think it's taken me a lot longer to get into leadership than it would have for a man. And I think one of the frustrations I and many women experience is simply feeling that we're not taken as seriously, that we're overlooked or we're not heard. Sometimes it feels no matter how hard you work, you get passed over for promotion or your male peers are simply earning more than you. My experience is very much, Michael, on the client buyer side. That's where I spent most of my career. But I've no reason to assume it's any different on the agency side or any different in any other industry. And in fact, in my own research, I did a survey which I carried out as part of research for my book on leadership, which involved a survey of 2,000 UK employees across a range of sectors, half of which were women. I found that 82% of women perceive that their own gender have a much harder time getting into those senior leadership roles compared to a man. 82%. That's worryingly high, particularly given all the diversity initiatives we've seen implemented over the last few years. It almost begs that question. Perhaps one of the problems here is that these initiatives are too token, perhaps they're just paying lip service. Now, I also asked the sample, well, what are the reasons you think women are having a much harder time? And depressingly, Michael, the reasons they gave were arguably reasons that I think women experienced like 20, 30 years ago, certainly when I was starting out in my career. So there were things like sexist attitudes about women not being tough enough or competent enough for leadership roles compared to men, gender stereotypes about women being less committed or less interested in leadership because of family or other caring responsibilities, the old boys' network that shuts women out. And given our societies are still very gendered around women taking the lion's share of caring responsibilities, then inflexible working environments and a culture of long working hours, very excessive hours, were other reasons that women gave for believing that it was much harder for women to rise into leadership roles. Now, that latter point about long hours, burnout, it is a problem that's widely recognised, isn't it, Michael, in our industry? And only last year there was a Market Research Society report which explored the high rate of attrition and retention that we have in our industry. It's on their website, which found that stress, burnout was a really common problem, made worse by the pandemic in many ways. But women often experience this more than men. So these are some of the hardships that women perceive that they still experience today, which makes it much harder for them to rise into those leadership roles.
Mm. One thing that I really appreciate is the rise of the personality testing, etc., that happens within organizations now, and there are some that um, sort of break down and compare how you work with your employees as well. And there's been a lot of uh, demystifying the perception that you need to be like an alpha male, a really strong,
Right, right. Yeah,
assertive
yeah,
extrovert to be a leader, but that's not necessarily the case at all.
right.
And there are some real big values about being someone that is potentially an introvert, is not your typical picture of what a leader is. Um, and you can have some really great, deep insights and perspectives um, and coaching that goes on from people that can observe and just step back. So there's definitely things that have been missing out from the leadership world as far as that's concerned.
Well, I think to that point, Michael, I think the most important thing I would like to really acknowledge here to your audience is that we need to recognize that these barriers that women experience are rooted at a systemic level, and they're not going to be fixed by, let's say, a bit of unconscious bias training, for example.
Mm,
And I would sort of slightly challenge you on that, in that we kind of need to move the focus from the individual to look at debiasing the entire working environment. And that means examining our organizational culture and analyzing those long held assumptions about what it means to be a leader
mm,
and what it means to be successful. So, back to that point you made about alpha male, you know, for me, great leadership isn't about being tough. It isn't about working long hours to prove yourself. It isn't about all those characteristics which one can say are rooted in those very toxic, masculine ideas of leadership, of being, let's say, very competitive or being very decisive. Let's take decisiveness. That one really makes me laugh. You often see decisiveness in a lot of job descriptions. We say we want somebody to be very decisive. Leaders need to be decisive. Well, that could mean making very quick and therefore very hasty decisions. And
mm,
those can be, consequently, the wrong decisions. Often, to make the right decisions, you need to be more thoughtful, you need to be more considered, and you need to have time. So it's not always about being decisive. And I think great leadership is also about having qualities like compassion, kindness, qualities that we associate very stereotypically with women, but we shouldn't, because men are also compassionate and kind. And women, just like men, can also be incredibly nasty and vile. Believe me, I've met many of those women. So these aren't gender specific qualities. Leadership is also about owning up to our mistakes and learning from our failures. And if we start to expect to see all these other more inclusive qualities in our leaders, then I think we're going to start to see more inclusive environments develop as a result. And women then won't feel that pressure, Michael, to
mm,
assimilate to that very alpha male, that very toxic masculine norm. Now, having said that, there are some very practical things that all organizations should be doing to foster that inclusive working environment that enable women to rise. And that does mean having tools and resources and processes and policies in place to make things happen. Otherwise, it will just be talk. And none of that is rocket science, right? It's mentoring, it's sponsorship at work, particularly having a male sponsor. I think given that men are already more likely to be in a position of leadership, then they're already going to have the resources to open doors for women and introduce those women to their professional networks. It's also about having fast-track leadership programs in place for women. It's making sure women and men are paid the same for the same work. And very importantly, Michael, it's about having flexibility at work. So, hybrid working arrangements, flexible working hours, which fortunately is one of the good things that's come out of the pandemic, that we've recognized that we can be just as productive, if not more so, with these more hybrid or remote working environments. And finally, I should say that all companies should have really good maternity, but also paternity policies in place. We need to allow fathers to take out time to take care of their children. We need to start normalizing that, so it's not always seen as the responsibility for women.
That's right. I guess there's also some potential changes that might have to happen in the recruitment side of things into leadership as well.
Sure. I mean, companies can be actively recruiting for more women. It depends on what country you are. I mean, in the US and the UK, we're allowed to have quota systems, and in the US, affirmative action is a thing. Not so much in the UK, and across in some European countries, it's actually not permissible. You can't actually specifically hire a particular gender. So it will differ. That said, companies can make sure that they're doing everything that they can to encourage women and support women to see themselves in those leadership roles, and to have more women role models that really champion that representation. There's that aphorism, isn't there, about you can't be what you can't see, and that's important. Representation for people of colour, for people with disabilities, for all minority groups. That's really important.
Yes, I mean, I had one of my previous podcast guests actually talked about that as well. So when she entered into the market research industry, she saw no one that looked like her in leadership and above her, and it was a really hard slog for her for a lot of years, and that she's finally starting to see that turn now, which is amazing. But it must be so encouraging, I guess, for this new generation of people to come through and see such diversity and go, yes, I can see myself being there.
It really matters. Absolutely, it really matters. It makes such a huge difference. And I love the fact that in the UK, we are incredibly diverse. We've got an incredibly diverse government. We've got an Asian, a Hindu, who is our Prime Minister. And in Scotland, we now have a Sikh Asian man who is leading the Scottish National Party. Now, 10 years ago, that would have been impossible. I mean, that just would not have happened. But what that does, it encourages people from those communities now to see themselves in those roles, and it really boosts that confidence. So representation really matters. I don't think we can really underestimate how important it is to see those leaders visually in front of our eyes.
So when we think about companies or organizations themselves, what are they missing out on when there isn't more representative leadership in place?
Well, apart from the fact that it's not a great look not to have a great, diverse leadership, I think the mere presence of women or people of colour at the top tells us that that company is walking the walk, and it's not just talking the talk, so to speak. I think that's really, really important. The other thing is, diversity simply pays off financially. There's plenty of research which shows that companies which have more diverse leadership display, for example, higher returns on capital, have higher margins, have higher earnings, have higher share price performance, and so on. I don't think we can say it's a causal relationship, but I think there's certainly a strong correlation. And that Credit Suisse piece of research I mentioned earlier, do have a look at it. It found that companies that had 30% or more of women in senior leadership outperformed across all financial metrics compared to those who had fewer than 30% of women in leadership. So again, having that diversity really improves the bottom line. So if it's not a moral imperative to have diversity, then it certainly is a financial imperative as well.
Mm. Now, that 30%, that metric that you that raised just there, reminded me of another initiative that you're part of. Do you mind sharing a little bit about that?
The 30% Club.
Yes.
Yes, that was created by Dame Helena Morrissey. I think about 20 years ago now, when we had an appalling representation on women on boards, and she wanted to make sure that by 2020 we had 30% of women on boards. And one of the ways that this, she envisaged we can do that is by mentoring women. Women leaders and male leaders will mentor women. So I got involved in that. I became a woman mentor to many other women. So I've been doing that for a few years now. And in fact, we have something like 44% of women are on boards now in the UK. So we've exceeded that target, which is absolutely marvelous. But that's the point about mentorship and role models. Really, really does make a big difference. But it's not enough, Michael. We need legislation. We need policies and processes really in place to facilitate that enabling culture.
That's right, and getting more women on boards and in leadership as well helps fast track that change as well, doesn't it? Because they're ones that can influence change in legislation and whatnot. Not that males can't either, because it's definitely there's benefits for them to do so as well.
Oh yes, I mean we need that male allyship, absolutely. We mustn't underestimate that either.
So you've mentioned it a little bit before with tokenism, performative change. So giving that appearance of being more diverse just to tick a box, but not actually making any change or any lasting change. I mean, one could almost argue that it's better a company didn't performatively change, so consumers, employees can see their true colors and perhaps vote with their wallets or where they choose to work. What are some examples that you've seen of performative change in leadership?
So if you mean being tokenistic, if that's what you mean, right, then I certainly have seen that. And I've, like I said, I've worked for a number of FTSE 100 companies. Many of my peers work for these FTSE 100 companies, Fortune 500 companies. I have seen brands bring in women into leadership positions or bring in a person of colour to lead their diversity efforts. And it can feel very much like a tick box exercise. And I've seen firsthand in some companies I've worked for where these folks come in and they don't stay very long. And that's because they're not supported. If a company's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion has to be embedded in everyday behaviours of their leaders, like I said, they need to talk the talk, and amongst their staff, it needs to permeate all the way across the entire organisation, horizontally, vertically. It can't be just a value statement that they push out on their website. And I think when companies say they're diverse and they're not, then they need to be called out. They need to be almost like named and shamed, so to speak, and that might propel them into action. And we have things like reported gender pay gap now, don't we? But perhaps we should also report pay gaps amongst people of different ethnicities, for example. And again, there's no legal requirement for companies to do that. Again, this will differ according to the legislation of different countries. Their equal opportunities and their race relations legislation will be very different. But in the UK, there has been discussion about having an ethnic minority pay gap report that companies start to actually track the pay of people of colour. And that's something that's not in place yet, but it's certainly something that people are talking about. So that could be another thing. I'm more mixed in my views about how helpful those things are. I think, if leaders start to really model and champion that inclusivity, and have policies and processes in place and really champion it, then I think we don't need to go down those more drastic measures, such as those pay gap reports.
I guess where all of this is heading is that we just treat everyone on merit.
Merit is important, but sometimes it's not enough. I mean, because sometimes if those systemic structures make it very difficult for people to see your talent, then you can be the most talented person in the world. But if you're a woman of colour, you're a woman of a working class background, it doesn't matter how bright you are, sometimes it's more difficult to be visible because of some of those systemic barriers that you experience. So sometimes merit alone isn't enough. We do need to sometimes give those underserved groups a little bit of a push to be more visible, and that push will look very different in different countries.
So I guess that's a good segue into one of our final questions tonight. What advice would you give women looking to get into a leadership role?
Well, before I mention what advice I would give, I think it's really, really important to emphasize that, the absence of gender parity right at the top and across many areas of society, in fact, isn't women's fault. This is not a problem caused by women. It's systemic and it's deeply rooted in cultural norms and patriarchal structures, and it isn't down to women to fix. Equity, equality, inclusion is everybody's responsibility. We all need to be mindful of that and do our bit. So I think that's really important to acknowledge. That said, there are, of course, very practical things women can do to elevate themselves into leadership. And these are things that are within their control. And these are things that really works for me. So things like develop your skills. You really need to invest in your personal and professional development to position yourself as a knowledgeable and capable leader. And that could mean both formal and more informal training. So seek that out. That's something that I've always done. And I feel learning must never stop. It's about lifelong learning. And I happen to love learning. So I'm always enrolling myself on a new course, or I'm seeking out support from my peers. The other thing I would really advise women is build your network. Building those strong relationships with colleagues and industry peers, particularly from networking activities, will help you develop that support system, and in doing so help you to increase your visibility within your industry. So that's the second piece of advice I would give. Find a mentor, of course. They can provide the guidance and the support and open doors for you. And I would really encourage women to also look to men sponsors in senior leadership to support them, because they already have that status. They already be in that privileged position to open that access to new opportunities for women. The other thing is, don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. Speak up for yourself, make your accomplishments and contributions known. Don't be shy about those things, And I think sometimes women can feel really uncomfortable about so-called bragging. Look, you've deserved it, showcase your accomplishments, and that way people will then see what you've achieved and want to get to know you better. Finally, I would say always remember to be a team player. Leadership is not about being in charge. It's also about working effectively with others. And that will help you build those strong relationships with other people. It's all about people and earning that respect from your colleagues and your peers and your leaders in return. So those are the sort of practical pieces of advice that I would give, Michael, to women.
And just one point on this as well is you mentioned it's definitely not just something for women to do. What can men do to help women rise as well? So you've talked about mentorship, encouraging networking, I guess, as well, and allowing team play, including different people with teams, etc. as well. Anything else to add on that part?
Sure. I mean, like I said, these are systemic issues. If you're a father, encourage your girls, to rise, to be captains of industry,
Yeah.
Really give that boost, if you're a father to daughters, and if you're a brother to sisters, encourage those women in your lives. If you're a peer to your female colleagues, have their backs. Really encourage them. Be aware of those additional challenges that being a woman brings, and that awareness will help you to support those women in your lives. And if you are a male leader, make time for the women in your organization to be a sponsor, to be an ally, to be a mentor. I mean, these days there are so many both informal and formal sort of activities and mentoring programs. There's no absence of initiatives one can get involved in. So I think it's about just taking those responsibilities. And the other thing I would say about fathers, Michael, is if you are a father, think about your own responsibilities in terms of that childcare and overall care and responsibilities. It's not just about childcare. Women often take the lion's share of caring for elderly parents, for example. And I see that a lot now that I'm at that age where I have elderly parents. I see a lot of my female peers actually start to really slow down in their work because now they're taking care of their elderly parents. So men as fathers and husbands, they need to see that they've got those responsibilities too. It's not just down to women to take those caring responsibilities. So I think all these little things really can sum up to make a big difference.
And just take that pressure off, doesn't it, to help the other, the 50% of the world that we're desperately needing to contribute more and not be blocked.
Absolutely, yeah. We are, remember, 50%. So what's that? 4 billion people are women.
No, you've given some great points there, and with being the father of 2 daughters, there's definitely some great words of wisdom there for helping encourage my 2 to be successful in this world. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Yes. So if I can quickly recap what we've talked about today. So we're really trying to get and help women rise into leadership. There's so much that we can gain from this. Parves raised the fact that 82% of women, just as part of research she'd done, feel it's hard for them to get to the top. She gave some barriers as to why. The problem we know is not just for women to tackle alone, but everyone needs to address this. We need to address some of the systemic issues that are in our company culture and society, etc. We know that we miss out as organisations when we don't have representative leadership as well. So there are real financial metrics and outcomes that can be improved by addressing this as well. And we also need to make sure, above all, that we're not just changing for performative sake, for tokenism. It needs to be genuine and authentic. We've had authenticity come in, be a real driver from the consumer perspective, and it's exactly the same for us as employees as well. So we need to see authentic change, authentic adaptation, and bringing in more women into leadership, and we'll all be better off for it, especially those of us that have got kids and daughters and whatnot as well, but even for us personally too. So yes, I think that covers it. Parves, any final points you wanted to finish on?
No, that's a great summary, Michael. That's fantastic. And again, I hope your audience finds that helpful.
Yes, thank you so much.
Any questions, then they can always come back to me directly.
Absolutely. So thank you for all of the work that you're doing, and thank you for all the listeners out there as well. Feel free to subscribe to the podcast, share it with others, reach out to ESOMAR, or check out some of the things that they're doing as well to advance the cause of women in leadership. Thank you very much for listening to Now That's Significant.